Welcome to the research sprint session of the 2023 National Energy Research and Policy Conference. So leading on from our excellent scene setting session, which is clear in identifying the scale of the challenge ahead, this session will showcase cutting-edge Irish research illustrating the various features required to achieve sustainable energy security. These will include focusing on energy sources, energy uses, required infrastructure, and policy options and implications. This year's conference, we changed our approach to securing our speakers, and we did an open call for applications in on the topic. It was very competitive, and thank you to all those that applied. We had a very strong strong pool of application, and it was a tough job for our reviewers. So, supply security of knowledge is also a key component and vital cog for Ireland's current and future sustainable energy. And with that, SEAI is very proud to be the National Energy Research Funder, funding innovation research projects through our National Energy Research Development and Demonstration Funding Programme. A number of these projects will be showcased here today. Another of our functions is collating all the energy research that happens within Ireland. And we'll also be showcasing here projects funded from other national funders and indeed the EU. So 6 researchers are here today. They've been set a challenge to highlight in 7 minutes, it's the sprint, the research gaps they've identified, how they're addressing them, and how this work will support policy. So before we get started, some housekeeping, a reminder to use the Q&A function throughout, and I'll ask questions after we do 3 presentations. I'll ask questions, and then we do another 3, and then more Q&A. So 7 minutes is hard to explain, often years of research, but so it will be a challenge, but we will get there, and I know the researchers will stick to their 7 minutes and give us enough time to chat about it and also to get everybody to their lunch today. So I will going to very briefly introduce the researchers because I want to give them as much time as possible, but please do look at their full profiles on up on the portal. Okay, so for the first, we're going to welcome Dr. Noreen Brennan. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Galway, and she's going to talk to us about her project Renewable Energy and Storage, an economic assessment of policy requirements in Ireland. Thank you, Noreen.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just be talking through some work that we're carrying out in the university, myself and my colleague Tom van Rensburg. So just to give a little bit of background to begin with, so increased renewables in Ireland could really help boost our energy security by reducing our reliance on fossil fuel imports. However, there's an issue that exists with renewables that doesn't really exist with other traditional forms of fossil fuels, and that's the issue of intermittency. So that just basically means that at certain times we might have more energy than is required to meet demand, and then other times we might not have sufficient renewables to meet demand. So renewable energy storage could really help boost our energy security and provides a host of other benefits such as system services, arbitrage opportunities, and environmental and social benefits. So the renewable energy sector could be a really key stakeholder in the development of storage in Ireland. But to date, the development from the sector has been somewhat limited. So in part of this research is to look at what are the barriers and opportunities to the renewable energy sector to engage in storage, what policy changes might encourage investment by that sector in storage. We also want to look at what are the public preferences for renewable energy storage. So to do that, we carried out a number of industry surveys and focus groups with both the renewable energy and storage industry in Ireland, as well as a public survey and focus groups. So just to quickly run through some of the public survey results. Firstly, so we carried out a survey of over 1,100 respondents in Ireland to look at preferences for wind energy development that incorporates some form of intermittency management. So one of the intermittency management solutions we looked at was the development of battery storage. So in general, our respondents view the development of battery storage with wind quite positively and have an equivalency of a willingness to pay of about €300 in additional electricity payments annually. However, there's significant heterogeneity in our results. So while 62% of our sample was strongly positive about the idea of developing battery storage with wind, about 23% were strongly negative and about 15% had no significant preferences one way or the other. In terms of our industry engagement, we carried out a number of focus groups, interviews and surveys with the sector. And in this engagement, we were looking at what are their preferences for storage development and what policy changes do they think would increase energy storage in the renewable energy sector. So in terms of our preliminary survey results, the respondents' preferences can be grouped into two classes, as we call them. So the first group, which contains about 63% of the sample, and the second group has about 37%. So in terms of policies that could increase engagement, the first group had strong positive preferences for anything that could help reduce dispatch down in the renewable energy sector. So dispatch down occurs when, for example, a wind farm developer receives a signal from the grid management agency to reduce their output to reduce pressure on the grid system. So anything that could help, any storage that could help reduce the level of dispatch down is seen quite positively by this group. And they're willing to pay about 37% of the equivalent of their either their DS3 or their RES payments, whichever applies to the respondent. One of the barriers to the renewable energy sector to engage in storage is how the RES payment system is set up for a wind farm developer. So currently, if they develop storage on site, they can store energy from their, for example, wind farm and still receive a renewable energy support scheme payment, but they can't pull energy from the grid. So that could create a limitation for the use of storage and a limitation for the sector to engage in storage. So we applied a sort of adjustment to this policy and called it a green grid policy, which would allow them to store energy from the grid and still receive their RES payment based on the mix of renewables that were on the grid at the time of storage. So this sector views a change to that policy quite positively and have a willingness to pay of about 53% of their annual payment. Another factor that we were looking at in terms of issues that could affect engagement in the sector is what type of technology are they looking at? So we looked at duration as a sort of a signifier of storage technology. So our first group has negative preferences for any policies that prioritize long duration over short duration storage. However, our class 2 respondents have positive preferences for anything that prioritizes medium and long duration storage over short. So we can see this heterogeneity in the sector in terms of preferences for technology. And so anything that sort of targets that might not be suitable to increase engagement across the sector. So in terms of other policy implications of our work, we think it's worthwhile to carry out an information campaign to provide information on the need for storage, technology costs, and health and safety, and so on. Community energy storage could increase engagement from the public and, increase acceptance. In terms of our engagement with the sector, they listed a number of issues in terms of the development of a definition of storage across the EU that's homogeneous, removal of certain barriers, setting targets, finalising Irish national policies, increasing funding supports, finalising green hydrogen policy, increasing skills and training in the sector, and then also making changes to RES policy could, to permit storage from the grid, could really increase the level of storage from the renewable energy sector. In terms of research requirements, we do need more input from the renewable energy and storage sector into the survey. So that's really important to have for the sector to have their say. So if you are a part of that sector or know someone who's willing to engage in the survey, do get in touch with me. It's not a very long survey and I can send you on the link. We think it's worthwhile to carry out an international study of the factors that impact storage policy across the EU. There might be different factors that are occurring in other countries and others that might be similar. And we think also it's worthwhile to carry out a national study of the viability of community energy with storage. So finally, those are some of the outputs from our work so far, and do contact me if you have any questions or want to engage with the survey. Thank you.
Thank you, Noreen. Excellent timekeeping and very important. Storage is going to be vital for that energy balancing piece. We can talk more afterwards. Okay, next up for the challenge is Dr. Vahid Aryanpur, who's a senior postdoc researcher at SIMREI in University College Cork. And he's going to talk to us about exploring the implication of road freight decarbonisation on energy security in Ireland. Thank you, Vahid.
Thanks for the introduction. My name is Vahid Aryanpur. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to share the insights from our research in University College Cork about the decarbonisation of road freight sector in Ireland and the potential implications for energy security. Trucks represent just about 5% of total vehicle in the Irish road, while they disproportionately contribute to over 20% of transport-related emissions. And it is expected that the demand will be doubled over the next 3 decades in Ireland. So to analyze the decarbonisation pathways and the potential impacts, in this study, we have used an comprehensive energy system optimization models and analyzing different scenarios, including a business as usual as a reference case, basically the continuation of our current trend versus net zero emission scenarios by 2050 and considering carbon budgets in place, and also a net zero plus intangible cost scenario, including some hidden costs associated with the adoption of advanced electric vehicles, such as higher recharging time and limited cargo capacity. So in this analysis, we used Times Ireland model. The right-hand side of this figure shows the details of road freight sector, including different goods vehicles, and disaggregated them into 3 main categories, from light, medium to heavy trucks, which are over 10 to meet demand in ton-kilometer. And on the left-hand side, you will see that the supply-side module produce different energy carriers, and an emission control module will control the decarbonisation, not only for this sector, but also across the whole energy system in Ireland. So here we will compare the cost optimal results of the stock evolution across 2 scenarios. Here I just show the evolution for the heavy trucks. In the reference scenario, the existing internal combustion engines are replaced with more efficient hybrid electric vehicles, while in the net zero scenario, the model offers a strong shift toward electrification, especially after 2030. In terms of total fuel demand, as you can see, and not surprisingly, diesel will dominate the market. And as expected, net zero scenario will move toward a strong electrification to meet the diffusion of electric vehicles in that scenario. And in terms of the total emission, as you can see in the reference scenario, it is expected to be double total emission from this sector, and decarbonized in net zero scenario, of course. But the green column also shows and highlights the importance of the heavy trucks to achieve an efficient decarbonization and having an early action to avoid lock-in effects. But let's moving on the implication for energy security. As you can see in this figure, the total diesel demand in reference scenario will be around 1.8 billion liters per year, which is a massive import dependency. And the diesel import cost is estimated to around 900 million euro a year, according to the current level of diesel cost in the international market. More importantly, it should be highlighted the total cumulative diesel cost across, just for the freight transport will be around 27 billion euros, while it will be halved as a result of decarbonization policies. More interestingly, this figure shows the price fluctuations of diesel cost over the last on a monthly basis over the last 2 years, and it highlights the importance of the interruption in supply side, and as a result of, for example, geopolitical tensions, and how they can increase the economic instability in unpredictable situation. This graph also estimates the health co-benefits will reach around €500 million over this study period, especially as a result of local air pollution reductions related to NOx and particulate matters. Needless to say that the mitigation policies, how it can diversify energy sources, and last but not least, it can improve the significantly increase the reliance on local and sustainable energy sources as a result of receiving net zero targets and mitigating policies. In terms of the policy notes from this research, mitigation policies have energy security co-benefits, including cost, health, and self-sufficiency. Heavy trucks have the highest emissions and should be prioritized their mitigation, and early action is vital to prevent lock-in effects. It's interesting that according to running over 100 scenarios and sensitivity cases, the results show that policy instruments that target operational expenditures over capital expenditures can enhance the competitiveness of the zero-emission trucks. I couldn't show the detailed results here, but the result will be published soon, which is a key policy note here. In terms of the support energy security, our research suggests 4 areas. Promoting the domestic production of green fuels can significantly improve energy security and job creation opportunities. And improving hydrogen and electricity infrastructure resilience is a key to ensure continued operation, and viability of developing contact line electric road system to assess assessing techno-economic viability is important, as they are major technologies and realized in some countries such as Ireland, such as Germany and Sweden. And finally, quantifying public health assessments are suggested to have some co-benefits or indirect benefits from the decarbonization policies. Thank you.
Many thanks, Vahid. Definitely some vital learnings there to be considered as part of the overall mix. So next up, before our first Q&A session, is Dr. Alan Henry. He's the Managing Director of Rockall Research, and he'll be talking to us about the project SIMREI, which is de-risking Ireland's floating offshore wind targets. Over to you, Alan. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerrie. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about a one-year project that's just finished called SIMREI. So that's looking at support infrastructure for marine renewable energy in Ireland. We've got a particular focus on floating offshore wind. As Kerrie said, the project was led by myself and Rockall with our partners, Wave Venture, who produces the software that we use, and MMCC Port Marine, who experts in ports and harbours and vessels, etc. And obviously the kind support of SEAI to make this happen. So what were we trying to do? So the objective of the project was really to determine the needs of the floating offshore wind industry in Ireland, particular focus on the port infrastructure required. It's widely accepted that Ireland does not have the port infrastructure to support this emerging industry. So what we were trying to do was to find what are the needs of the industry. Ireland has very large targets. 30 gigawatts of floating offshore wind and even more has been touted. So what do we need to make that happen? So how did we do this? Well, we used the Wave Venture software to build essentially simulations of the marine operations of building out these floating offshore wind farms. So that involves, assembly of the turbine in port, the tow out to the farm, even failures that happen offshore and the maintenance that's required. And we also include all the met-ocean conditions, so tidal restrictions, waves, wind, etc. So by doing this, we look at the whole life cycle of a wind farm or even a cluster of wind farms, or even what a port can actually do over a period of 20, 30 years. So that gives us some really good insights into the kind of restrictions that we're going to face in various scenarios. So there's a report that's actually available on the SEAI, the Energy Research Database, which you can download. So the key learnings, I guess, here are really that, again, we don't have the port infrastructure. So what do we need? Well, each of our ports would need a minimum of to be able to store, enough kit for 3 full sets of the components for a floating offshore wind turbine. So remembering that these turbines are getting kind of bigger every year. They're currently the size of the Eiffel Tower, to give a bit of perspective. And we also need, probably more importantly, along the quayside in a port, we need to be able to store about 3 floating offshore wind turbines, and they'll be in various stages of assembly. And then, looking at more of a national context, we need a minimum of at least 3 ports with those facilities. The next up is wet storage. Wet storage is essentially a term used to describe an area where wind turbines go, which isn't the wind farm and it's not the port. When turbines are fully assembled, they're waiting for a certain weather window to be towed, 50 kilometers offshore and mooring hookup and electrical hookup. So essentially there needs to be some kind of holding space for them. It can't be in the port because obviously we're congested. So we looked a lot at wet storage and what the capacity of wet storage would be required. And really with our weather conditions, wet storage is going to be a critical issue for Ireland moving forward, and we need to define those areas. Next up again leads on to those weather restrictions. I mean, Ireland does have an absolutely fantastic wind resource, but that wind resource and also the knock-on wave resource that we have leads to challenges to working offshore in our environment. So what we really found was that we have, infrequent and relatively rare short weather windows to do offshore operations. So in the Irish context, we're likely to need more vessels. And actually, we were quite surprised that we'd need those vessels year round. So essentially, when a weather window opens up, we need to get busy with multiple vessel fleets working in parallel to install these floating offshore wind turbines, or even to recover ones that are in need of maintenance or repair. In terms of the project's inputs to policy, I mean, it can be kind of quite wide-ranging, but again, Ireland has targets to develop 30 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2050. The outputs of our project should feed into a port development strategy and of course leveraging funding for that port development too, which will be quite large scale. Port coordination as well. I mean, it's not just those 3 large ports. The secondary ports, smaller harbours will also be busy with other tasks such as, handling moorings, cables, crew transfer, etc. The ORES scheme as well. I mean, we looked at installation rates for farms. So we've got a better understanding of what maybe long stop rates, etc. would be. And again, marine spatial planning, that need for wet storage, I think, SIMREI outputs really kind of focuses in on what kind of capacity of wet storage you need. And obviously, where you need that. Looking kind of forward, floating offshore wind, represents the largest opportunity for Ireland to secure its energy security. I mean, essentially, 30 gigawatts, as Mark spoke about earlier, is probably larger than what we need. So we then become a net exporter. But we need the ports and we need to develop a supply chain in order to make this happen. The method that we've used, the SIMREI method, really provides that evidence-based outputs for stakeholders, which is really, really useful and great for kind of de-risking certain areas of the sector. But we do feel we need to go further. I mean, the one-year project, did look at everything on a high level, but it's also worth saying that this is an emerging technology, and some of the variables, like, the size of the unit seem to change every year. So certainly, a follow-on project is recommended, and I think it needs to take into account that national context. So I just threw in that image there just to remind everyone that, floating wind turbines as it stands today, 15 megawatts, are essentially the size of the Eiffel Tower. That's bigger than anything in Ireland. It dwarfs the Poolbeg Towers or the Spire in Dublin. So yeah, this is kind of big business. So really, that's it from me. Again, I'd remind you that the report is available on the SEAI Energy Research Database. And yeah, please feel free to reach out and contact me if you want to discuss further.
That's great. Thanks so much, Alan. We will now move on to the Q&A session. I guess for all three of you, mindful that we have policymakers in the audience today, could you pull out the key action, the key call for action that can be implemented right now, deriving from your research? Mindful, Vahid, we might start with you in this one, because you did call out that early action is required to avoid lock-in effect. So what is that? If you were to pull one from the findings of your research, what would that be?
Yeah, in terms of my research, it shows that most of the car haulage companies in Ireland, from small and family-based businesses, that they need adequate supports to adopt less commercialized vehicles, and they usually invest. They expect a higher rate of return and lower payback period. So in their investments, so the government needs to carefully, care about, the incentives that define. It's not just about the capital expenditures and direct incentives. It also related to adequate infrastructure to ensure that the car haulage companies, operators, and logistic companies will have timely delivery of different goods, and they have enough space for recharging stations. So it is important to communicate with your stakeholders based on the Irish environment, and then support them based on their requirements.
Thank you, Vahid. Noreen, same question for you. What would be the key call to action for the policymakers?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few actions that could be taken immediately. Some of out of our public engagement work, a lot of what came out when it comes to storage is just a lack of knowledge about it, and when you have a lack of knowledge, you get a little bit of fear over what the implications are, for example, for living near large-scale battery storage or any kind of storage facility. So I think early engagement, the provision of information about what the need for the development of storage, because again, a large proportion of the sample didn't really care about it or viewed this development of storage quite negatively. So more information is needed on why we need storage, what type of storage is being developed, where are suitable places to develop it. Again, support for community energy storage could be a really key factor in increasing public engagement and information on that. And then for the industry side, supports for the development of storage, the removal of certain barriers for the renewable energy sector to engage in storage, finalising certain national electricity policies, and just having that information, perhaps setting targets could really set a good signal to the market. And also on the more long-term side, there's a lack of skills and training in that sector. So I think increasing that, focusing on the renewable energy and storage sector when it comes to skills and training could really be good areas to focus on.
Thanks for that, Noreen. I guess, and it's what Alan had started talking about, is that de-risking or the socializing or demystifying through demonstration and through trialing, perhaps with a community, as you called out. And Alan, over to you. What would be your?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need a port development strategy. We need to coordinate what our ports are doing and what they're going to do in the future. You know, if we're serious about floating offshore wind, we're going to be moving around very large pieces of equipment, and we're going to be doing that for the next decades. You know, so it's not just the installation piece of getting them out into the water; it's also maintaining them as well. So like as a high level thing, I would say the ports are going to be very, very busy over the next decades, and they need to start building now. And in order to build, these ports need security that the work is coming, and that filters back to, you know, even the project developers as well. So developing that strategy, you know, that access to funding, you know, we're talking about, you know, some of these port developments are going to cost, you know, 100, 200 million. They may take, you know, 5 to 10 years. So we need to be moving quickly, you know. So that would be it for me. I mean, the kind of secondary one is understanding where these units are going to be stored while they're waiting to be either put out in the farm or brought back in for maintenance. That wet storage piece, I don't think that is it's really been looked at in any detail to date.
Between the storage and the ports and the transport is like an element of high degree of stakeholder market development and
there's a lot of variables,
examining incentives and spatial planning ultimately on
spatial
this.
planning,
No, very good. And then again, look, thinking of the rest of our audience here today, there's a lot of researchers, and if you're thinking of your research as now you're presenting on where it is at the end, but during your research, I'm sure you've identified what comes next in your research. I'm wondering what's the composition or what's the actors across the system to advance your research to the next stage. Perhaps we'll start with you, Noreen, this time.
Yeah, perfect. In terms of the work that we've done, we've just highlighted that perhaps community energy storage could increase engagement, but we don't really have an example of that here in Ireland, and we don't really know that for sure. So I think that would be a great place to start. You know, to move this work on a little bit more, because there's a focus coming down the road from the EU and in Ireland to some extent at community energy, you know, as a good way of increasing energy security for maybe areas that aren't as connected to the grid, and maybe as a way of reducing impacts on the grid and increasing acceptance of renewables in general. But again, storage will be a key factor in developing offshore and onshore renewable energy in Ireland. So some sort of, you know, on the ground example of community energy storage would be the logical next step of this work. And also, as I highlighted, you know, there are different factors that are particular policy barriers in Ireland to the development of storage that maybe don't exist in other countries, or maybe they have their own specific barriers. And then there might be similarities, like there exists, you know, difficulties in the definition of storage across the EU when it comes to receiving, you know, benefits or just developing storage in general. So the next step would be looking outside of Ireland and to see what implications you know, these policy barriers have in other countries as well. So that would be two kind of logical next steps for our work.
Learning by doing, so yeah, absolutely. And Alan, from the next iteration, you did a year, so I'm sure that bubbled up a lot of gaps to advance.
It did, yeah, and we, you know, we put a lot of effort into, we've very many variables in our simulation, so we put a lot of effort into, you know, talking to the right stakeholders to get the most up-to-date information, as best we could, and then doing sensitivity studies on those different variables to see, you know, what made a difference, and do we need to go back and look at that again. I think, you know, I keep saying the word variables, but there is so many. I think we need to engage with various parties as we've kind of done in the year. You know, they're project developers, they're technology developers, to understand what the technology looks like. You know, the ports, the harbour masters, etc., vessel operators. So really the next iteration for us is just more and more detail. And maybe it is, you know, what we maybe didn't get to is the full national context. Like, what does a simulation with 30 gigawatts of floating offshore wind turbines look like? I mean, that is 2,015 megawatt turbines. So what does that look like? How busy is that maintenance element? How many units are being repaired in our ports? And yeah, just going one step forward. And I guess, yeah, I'd like to thank the kind of stakeholders, because people have been very, very enthusiastic about the project and really fed in as best they could. So that's been really, really useful for us.
It seems like quite a sizable consortium to some interesting challenges there.
Mm-hmm.
And Vahid, on the transport and freight transport side, where do you go to now on a research perspective?
Yeah, thank you. I would say that the next step of this project would be assessing, as I mentioned, the techno-economic viability of contact line electric road systems in Ireland. Especially the first phase would be having a spatial analysis to identify the most busiest and pathways, perhaps in Dublin County, to develop a kind of electric highway, as currently we have some major samples in Sweden and Germany. Would be the next step of this analysis, and also to support policymaking, you know, and to justify the huge investment that we need for the transition. The public health assessments and the co-benefits and indirect benefits that can be realized through decarbonization policies might be highlighted, and some research should show to what extent those decarbonization policies might be helpful. And over a longer term, then we need to see how much electricity or hydrogen infrastructure we need to keep the resilience of our system and ensure some continued, you know, operation even during, you know, natural tensions that perhaps we have. So a mixture of those actions would be the next steps based on our research.
And very quickly, just we're coming to the last few moments. Just in terms of hydrogen and electrification, which do you see as the dominant in road freight decarbonisation?
For the case of the heavy goods vehicles, it seems that hydrogen would be dominant, especially according to our knowledge at the moment. I would say after 2040 would be the key solution. But from now to 2040, over the short and medium term, I would say electricity would be a key player, especially for light and medium vehicles, because we will have, you know, when we have larger batteries for heavy trucks, then we should struggle with limited cargo capacity and higher recharging time that need to be solved. So for heavy trucks, you know, for over 10 ton, I would say hydrogen, but for small and medium trucks, electricity would be more likely solution.
Okay, thank you very much, Vahid. And then I get Noreen, how do we even look at this from a policy perspective? How can we, of course, we use this mechanism to bridge research to policymakers, but what other avenues are available or would be suggested to make sure we're having the best information in the hands of decision makers?
Yeah, I think we probably need to learn from other countries that have developed storage quite successfully. If we're just looking at the storage angle, first of all, you know, for example, the UK has had certain policies that have really helped boost the level of energy storage over there, and they've helped create a sort of easier market for the development of storage. So it's a little bit different in Ireland. So I think there are lessons that we can learn on how storage has been developed elsewhere. And then also in terms of the community energy storage side, we can look to other countries that have successfully developed community energy, where perhaps in Ireland these barriers don't this hasn't been developed to date. So I think learning from others that have, you know, gone down that road quite successfully is a good way to bridge that. Okay,
thanks, Noreen. And it's the final few seconds to you, Alan, for this session, first half. For you, do you see any further mechanism to bring research to policymakers?
Well, that's a bigger question. I guess, you know, all somebody like myself can do is publish the report and push it out there and publicize it as much as possible. You know, I don't know where it lands, I guess. I mean, I'm not the first person to say we need ports in Ireland. So, you know, the time for action is now, you know. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I guess slightly over, but in relation to the other two presentations and ports, how do you see the interrelationship between the storage and the freight?
Yeah, well, I guess it's a big ecosystem, isn't it? I mean, that's what we're facing into. Like, what we're trying to do is change our, you know, the whole fabric of our systems. And yeah, there's huge. I mean, floating offshore wind, like the storage element of that is going to be massive. Electricity demand from freight, yeah, it's all interconnected, and we did actually look at using our model to look at the energy generated, you know, because we can actually model what the energy generated is, and then look at storage. But it was a little bit of a bridge too far, to be honest, because things are complicated, you know, and there's a lot of variables. So yeah.
I think that's the perfect capturing of it all. Thank you very much to the three of you. We will now move to the second round of our sprint. First to speak is Sarah Stanley, who's a PhD researcher in UCD, and she's going to talk about her study of energy security in the low inertia electricity grids. Thank you, Sarah.
Hi everyone, just 1 sec, I'm trying to share my screen. Yeah, you can see everything? Okay. Hi, my name is Sarah Stanley. I am going to talk to you today about energy security in low inertia electrical grids. And so when I talk about low inertia power systems, I'm talking about power systems that are going to be relying on very high shares of variable renewables, such as wind and solar. And I'm going to be using the asynchronous system of Ireland in 2030 as a case study, where we have targets for 80% renewable electricity. I'm a part-time PhD student in UCD and part of UCD's Energy Institute, and I'm also a member of UCD's Empower Group, which is funded by DEC. So when we talk about operational security in power systems, a lot of the time we're talking about maintaining a stable frequency or voltage, or the ability of units to ride through any deviations in frequency or voltage. So UCD has built its own model of the Irish power system in 2030. It's based on Backbone, which is a unit commitment and economic dispatch model, and it's open source and can be downloaded if you follow the link. So into this model, we've built our own operational reserves. So that's we've put in primary and tertiary reserves, which can come on at very rapid speeds to rebalance any deviation in or imbalance in demand and supply. So on top of that, we've also included a rate of change of frequency two dynamic rate of change of frequency constraints, which ensure that there's enough inertia in the system which can slow down rate of change of frequency events. We have 3 minimum online units in different regions throughout the country to ensure voltage support. We also have 95% SNSP constraints, and we've included enhanced flexibility, which refers to the system's ability to respond to changes in supply and demand. So if you look at the icons in the middle, we've made the optimistic assumption that 60% of passenger vehicles and commercial electric vehicles are going to be load shifting by 2030. So that is they're actively charging their vehicles at the least cost times of the day, which will reduce the stress on the grid. Then we have different sensitivities with different rates of interconnection to Great Britain and France. We've included different storage of different durations in the model. We have heat pumps, which are also actively load shifting throughout the day and night. We have synchronous condensers, which provide a low carbon source of inertia and removes the need to rely on conventional gas plants. We've also assumed that data centers, which could make up to a quarter of the load in 2030, can load shift. And we've included fast-acting gas plants. So whenever there's a sudden imbalance in demand and supply as a result, for instance, of a fault on the transmission wire or from the tripping of a large gas plant, you're going to have a change of frequency. And if we meet our targets for the Climate Action Plan from 2023, we're going to have over 22 gigawatts of wind and solar power on the system. And that's going to be producing electricity which is in excess of our national requirements over around approximately half of the time in 2030. So if that's the case, we're going to be exporting at a maximum capacity on the Celtic interconnector to France. And given the potential loss of 700 megawatts on the interconnector, our rock-off constraints ensure that there's going to be inertia from conventional generation, synchronous condensers and hydro to ensure operational security in the event of such a loss of load. On the other hand, the greatest risk of frequency instability from a loss of an infeed from generators is when there's the net load is close to zero. Most of demand is being met by renewable generation, and there might only be 3 generators online for voltage support, and the loss of one of those generators can have quite a significant impact on the rock-off. So in addition to reliability in the face of a sudden loss of load or generation, we've also included flexibility, which is beneficial for meeting variation in supply. And we've got different technologies which are beneficial for different reasons, have different values. So you can see here in terms of system costs, if we include synchronous condensers, there's a dramatic reduction in the system's costs. So that's as a result of CCGT plants aren't being switched on at minimum load just to provide inertia to the system. Whereas with storage and load shifting, you can see there's more of an impact on a reduction on imports and the use of peaking plants to provide generation adequacy during peak hours. And if you look at the final column, you can see that if we add all of these different types of flexibility together, that they don't greatly erode each other's savings effect. So if we meet our targets in 2030, we're going to be producing approximately 50 terawatt hours of renewable electricity, depending on the weather year. And then demand is projected to be around 40 or between 40 and 50 terawatt hours in 2030. So the problem lies when there is a temporal or spatial mismatch between the two, and you can see in the first graph that there's going to be instances during the year where we're going to be producing 10 gigawatts of renewable power in excess of our national load. And that's where our average load is projected to be around 5 gigawatts. So the middle chart is a seasonal breakdown of the average net load, and you can see on average we're going to be producing approximately 3 gigawatts of additional renewable power in the afternoon, and that's primarily due to the large investment in solar. So when we introduce all that flexibility into the system, you can see that the load shifts to the afternoon and to overnight to absorb excess wind overnight and solar in the afternoon. But still, we're going to have very high rates of surplus electricity and also curtailment due to operational constraints. So just to finish up, flexibility and stability are not always very well represented in future scenarios, but they're essential for reliable supply. So stability-orientated constraints force CCGT units online. However, the cost is reduced by synchronous condensers. Flexible loads can reduce our requirements for peak plants, the use of peak plant during peak hours, and increases usage of solar. However, to really reduce curtailment of wind requires greater interconnection or more seasonal storage options. Our simulations are showing that emissions are still beyond the 3 megawatt target, so we need to do more work there in our modelling and looking at options. So we're going to be doing more research into generation adequacy, low carbon generation adequacy during periods of low wind and solar, looking at different weather years. Also, more research is needed for low carbon fast frequency response. So particularly looking into the future at 100% SNSP. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sarah. Okay, we'll now move over to my colleague, Conall Mahon, who is a Programme Executive in the Decarbonised Heat team in the Research and Technology Department of SEAI. And he's going to talk to us about options for hard-to-abate infrastructure.
Thanks, Kerrie. Sorry, just give me a second here. I just need to share my screen. Yep, as Kerrie had mentioned there, I'm going to be taking you through a presentation on options for hard-to-abate infrastructure. This is based on an SEAI commissioned study, and at the end I'll take you through some lessons learned based on that. So, first things first is, what do I mean when I say hard-to-abate? So these are usually industrial energy sites that use high-temperature heat processes using cheap fossil fuels. There's a challenge in decarbonising these sites because many of the high-temperature renewable options may not be commercialised or do not compare cost-wise to fossil fuels. While there's a challenge, there's an opportunity. So for the energy system, as many of these large industrial sites have characteristics that could benefit in the utilisation and the generation of renewable fuels, so things like handling facilities, large electricity connections. So there's synergies there that both the energy system and these sites could meet decarbonisation and energy security goals. We notice there's an Irish-specific data gap for these large industrial sites. So we commissioned a study on cost and CO2 analysis for 8 mainly bioenergy technologies. It was based on the characteristics of Money Point coal power plant in Clare. However, it was more a case study. So we're looking at characteristics like the deep water port. However, the actual findings are applicable to all large industrial sites. So just what we're looking at here, I mentioned the 8 options. So there's 3 bioenergy options at the top, 3 gaseous fuel options, and 2 transport fuel options. We looked at actually just producing the fuel, so not looking into the end use of these fuels. It includes a CO2 price, however, it doesn't include current supports to make it a fair comparison. And these are based on mature development, so think post-2030 installation. So to take you through the actual graph here, the LCOEs of the fuel, so how much it costs to produce, are in the box, and then the bar graph is these LCOEs versus fossil fuel cost. So the way of reading this, I'll just take an example here. Hydrogen from gasification of biomass actually has the lowest LCOE. However, it has a differential much higher than, let's say, bioethanol, because the bioethanol is compared to gasoline versus natural gas. Gasoline is more expensive than natural gas. There's loads I could go into in this, but the main thing I just want to say here is all of the options have a bar. So what that means is they're all more expensive than fossil fuel. So they'll need some type of support. Decisions on what should be supported and how require a national, multifaceted analysis, taking in externalities like energy security. So I mentioned support. One of the main things to think about when you're thinking of support will be the carbon emissions. Here, I'll just take you through the example of hydrogen from electrolysis. So we're comparing the renewable options to the fossil fuel options. So in theory, the smaller the bar, the less carbon emissions. We have 3 different colors on this graph. So first of all, I take you through the dark red, which is combustion emissions. So the burning of the fuel, which would typically be analysed. Next, the dark blue, life cycle emissions within Ireland. So think perhaps driving of the feedstock to the plant within Ireland. Finally, the green colour, which are the life cycle emissions, which wouldn't typically be analysed. The first 2, the combustion and within Ireland, are what you think of when you think carbon budgets. However, we think there's real value in looking at other life cycle emissions as well. So, and on that, the main takeaway here is there's very few zero carbon fuels. So there's some impact. So it's important to take in the full life cycle impact. So if you look at hydrogen, it has quite a few outside Ireland emissions. These are the components for electrolysis plant. And the final point I'll just make on this is if we look at the biomass options, it's quite a large life cycle impact. So this is because biomass is imported. So these emissions are happening outside of Ireland, so processing, growing. If we didn't look at this life cycle perspective, then we wouldn't get a true reflection of the emissions. And just the final point on this is if our final goal is to decrease carbon emissions and stop the effect of climate change, we know the effects of climate change won't stop at the IRC, so we need to look at this from a life cycle perspective. So finally, I just want to go through some of the lessons. So I've just mentioned there about the life cycle point of view and how it relates to decarbonisation. Same thinking can be thought of when it comes to energy security. So we're not just thinking of the actual final fuel and energy security related to that. We have to think of every step of the components. And it's embedding that into thinking into policy analysis. Main point on the results was options analysed may be feasible to supply with support. However, for further research on this, we need to look into demands for these fuels and how to close that cost gap and what's the most effective way to do that. Final point, there's real value in looking at a single case study. However, I think what's next needed is having a strategic view of these renewable fuels and how are they going to meet national targets in energy security and decarbonisation. Also a point on optimising biomass use. Bioelectricity plant may not be allowed for support under RED 3 due to concerns of resource efficiency, so we need to take that into account. And just to tie in everything together, my recommendation would be a renewable fuel strategy, which would achieve all 3 of these points. This would be cross-sectoral and would break down silos, and it would take into account all fuels, look at how they should be supplied, where they're needed, and how that should be supported. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, feel free to email on the email address supplied.
That's great. Thank you very much, Conall. And certainly assessing on a life cycle emissions basis really leans into the first session where global solutions for a global problem. So we really need to be looking at things from that perspective. Okay, our final researcher for the Sprint Challenge is Dr. Fiona DeBoy-McAleef. She's a research fellow in SIMREI, also in University College Cork. And she'll be taking us through a project floating offshore wind arrays, which is a key step in achieving Ireland's energy security. Thanks, Fiona.
Hey, thanks very much, Kerrie. Hi, everyone. My presentation today is on floating offshore wind arrays, which are a key step in achieving Ireland's energy security. And I'll be particularly presenting a relatively new project that's funded by SEAI called IDEA Ireland, looking at the integrated design of floating wind arrays in Ireland. So in terms of energy security, we're talking about the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. That's what we want to achieve. But we also want to achieve a net zero emissions future. So to achieve that energy security and our decarbonisation targets, we need these reliable and affordable renewable energy sources. So we have our very good natural resource of offshore wind. We have one of the best globally, and we have our targets to deploy up to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 with another 2 gigawatts in development, and then again 20 gigawatts, I think, by 2040 and 37 gigawatts by 2050. So we have our timeline and our targets, but we are initially focusing on fixed offshore wind on the East Coast. This is just because it's a more mature technology, but in order for us to actually exploit our offshore wind resources on the south and the west coast of Ireland, we're going to have to use floating offshore wind technology in these areas. So as Alan has said previously, floating offshore wind is quite an emerging industry still. So it's a major opportunity for Ireland to take the lead in this sector. Its development would not only help us achieve Ireland's energy security, but also create a potential export market for Ireland electricity to the EU and the UK. But we have a lot of research gaps to address, and that's what our project is focusing on. We have little real-world experience, particularly of floating offshore wind at the large array scale, and all the extra additional problems that come with that, some of which Alan has touched on in his presentation. And we also have very little reliable, accessible data for industry and researchers to build upon. So that is really what IDEA Ireland wants to look at in collaboration with an International Energy Agency task, IEA Wind Task 49. So just to give you a background of the IEA task, the IEA fund a number of research projects or tasks to facilitate the international collaboration of researchers that address key questions and issues. So the Task 49 is including over 100 different organizations from 11 different countries around the world, mainly working on a voluntary basis to look at developing integrated designs of floating offshore wind arrays. And IDEA Ireland is supporting our national participation in that task, as well as allowing us to do additional research that focuses on Ireland, so doing Irish-specific scenario modelling of floating offshore wind arrays. So it's really helping place us at the forefront of this collaborative international effort to facilitate the sustainable development of floating offshore wind. So I'll just present a little bit of what we're working on at the moment and what we're expecting to produce within the project. So as I said, there's little reliable information for people to build upon, particularly at array scale for floating offshore wind. So we're going to be developing open access site data sets around the world and specifically for Ireland, as well as a number of array reference designs, including input files for engineering models, cost models, environmental impact models. So our hope is that we can develop best practices as well for the design of these arrays that people can use as a basis, a common basis for reference to build upon. In addition to that, we're engaging with international flow experts and marine spatial planning agencies to learn best practices in this area, which, as you've heard, is a big need And as well, we're looking at collecting open research questions and the potential innovations that might come on stream with flow as it emerges and becomes a more mature technology, and the associated marine spatial planning requirements that would happen with those as well. So we're conducting a number of surveys and interviews currently, and if you're interested in being involved in those, please have a look at our website to get involved. We're also engaging with Irish stakeholders, particularly those in the Irish supply chain, to identify the gaps and opportunities that might be there via surveys and interviews. So again, please have a look at our website and sign up to our contact list if you would like to participate in some of those. What we're hoping to achieve is working out ways that will maximize our local content, as well as recommendations in terms of different supports that would facilitate that going forward. We also want to raise awareness of floating offshore wind generally and the different social, economic and environmental benefits associated with that. And in those terms, in addition to the surveys and the interviews and the reports that we'll be issuing across the course of the 3-year project, we're also going to have a podcast series. I hope the first will be released this month, that will look at the elements that go into designing a floating offshore wind array, and raising awareness of the different benefits that can have for Ireland in particular. Ultimately, what we want to achieve is to produce a roadmap for Ireland for the sustainable development of floating offshore wind. So we're going to conduct a number of Irish scenario-based modelling activities that will build upon research from previous projects that we've been involved in. Some of you might have heard of these before, air, wind and upflow projects. So we want to build upon those with the latest information and best practice that we've developed in this project in collaboration with the IEA task, and ultimately come up with a long-term development plan for Ireland post-2030 in terms of different array scales, the development timelines, the infrastructure requirements, etc. So ultimately, our project wants to inform policy and provide some recommendations in areas including the level of financial support that is required for flow and/or seabed leasing fees, specific amendments that might be required for our marine spatial planning regime, realistic local content requirements based on our supply chain surveys, and the supports, policies and programs we would recommend to maximize that local content, as well as, I said, strategic infrastructure and investment timelines. Our project, as I said, is relatively new. We just passed the 6-month timeline, and we are continuing until January 2026. So there's lots of time to get involved in surveys or interviews that we're conducting. There's a QR code for our contact list on the screen there. We'll also have podcasts coming out and reports, and you can see links to these on our website. Here's our email address if you want to get in touch. And we also have a page on LinkedIn if you'd like to follow us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fiona. That's great. I might actually just stick with you, Fiona, if I could, for a Q&A. You're mentioning the plan to raise awareness and podcast sounds great. I'm wondering of your opinion of the correlation between awareness and acceptability.
I wouldn't have any figures to hand at the moment, but I do think that there's a number of areas where raising the awareness would take the mystery out of it. We're not entirely sure necessarily what we're envisaging when we're saying floating offshore wind. So I would have had conversations with a lot of people in terms of would they not just float off into the ocean? So I think raising awareness of what's actually involved in a floating offshore wind turbine can take the mystery out of it for people, just general stakeholders in the community, so they know what we're really talking about. And I think once they understand how it's moored and what it will do and what it will look like perhaps from the shore, then I think that can definitely increase social acceptance.
Okay, thank you for that. And Conall, a question has come in based on you mentioning it's based on insulation post 2030. And will forecasting that far ahead have inherent risk, or how has that been addressed?
Yeah, the short answer on that is yes. There will be some risk. If I could have made a fourth point if I had the time, it probably would have been the study itself would have been going on at the same time as the Ukraine invasion and the effect that that had on fossil fuel prices. So we even seen within the project that the results were changing quite largely. When we're talking about post 2030, the forecast, how we have tried to deal with the risk as best as we can is to have as much sensitivity analysis as possible. That's going into technology, going into things like cost, going into the actual resource itself. But in terms of that, the best way I could say to actually deal with it is you have to make a decision based on the information you have at that time, but that anything has to be iterative. So you're constantly looking, following trends, and that's part of our job is to keep on top of those trends.
Okay. Thanks, Conall. So, Sarah, we hear kind of anecdotally feel that each percentage more about resi from where we are right now is exponentially harder than where we've got to. Are there any low-hanging fruits or quick wins that we can do to just start increasing the resi that can be acted on now in terms of cost and technology availability?
Yeah, I guess there's two answers to that question. All right. So when you talk about the percentage of resi, you can talk about the instantaneous penetration, so how much renewables can be accepted by the grid securely. And you can see that Air Grid is doing great work in that sense, and we've already reached 75%. And they've increased the target to 95% by 2030. And that's going to require faster acting reaction speeds from reserves and things like that. But also, if you're looking at increasing the share of renewables throughout the year, you're looking at removing some of the maybe roadblocks to investing in more capacity. And you're seeing that happening, I guess, in the planning system at the moment. So, facilitating these offshore wind and solar targets for the next 7 years. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Sarah. Fiona, you mentioned your international collaboration piece between the IEA and other experts across. Could you just explain the value to that international engagement?
Yes, so I mean, the purpose is to foster the international collaboration on key research topics and questions. So it's to get people to come together and learn from each other, particularly what's going on in different areas of the world, so that we can actually, see what's happening and discuss as a group perhaps what should be happening. So it's to learn best practices, develop best practices, and to pool our knowledge and our experiences together, and I think it's invaluable.
Absolutely, yeah, time is of the essence, and if we can accelerate by learning that's from each other, that's great. Conall, I've another question, zooming in on the mix that you mentioned on hydrogen. Like, where do you see its role, and what is the best, weighing off the use and the cost of installation, and where do you see hydrogen fitting into the mix?
I'll probably start it as that's probably the main gap in our analysis, is that we are just looking at producing the fuel. So next would be the actual demands. But in terms of short term, seems to be things like heavy transport. Not to go on the point the previous researcher said, but that it seems to be more in transport. In terms of actually trading off costs versus other benefits, I think that will need a much more complete analysis, because it's not just decarbonisation. There's quite a lot of other externalities that we need to take account of, and especially energy security. So what is actually required in the energy system? It wasn't really in scope of the project, and really would take a much higher view. I need to have everyone in the room to go through that.
Okay, thanks for that. And then over to you, Sarah, and in terms of collaboration and stakeholders, who are your key people to bring you through this study that you'll draw on or work with?
Well, I think UCD has quite strong links. Well, the Energy Institute has quite strong links with EirGrid. We do quite similar work to them. But also, you know, I think more and more different researchers that are feeding into policy are collaborating in terms of the data that they're producing. So we're sharing more of that information, and yeah, it's so yeah, I guess collaborating with other research institutions such as, you know, in UCC and SEAI also.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just opening up all to you, similar to the last group, if you were to do a call out to the policymakers who are watching here today, what would be your single thing that you'd like a message to land, Fiona?
I think I would echo what Alan said in terms of we need to act very quickly, especially if we want to take the lead in the floating offshore wind sector. We're missing the boat on that, so we do need to act quickly. And I think what would help really is a firmer view of what the process is in terms of marine spatial planning and supports and infrastructure development for floating offshore wind. We need a firmer idea of that for developers. I feel like they're ready. They're just waiting for more clarity in a number of areas. So that would be mine.
Sarah, what would be your top of your wish list? Yeah, like, I mean, I think we have extremely ambitious targets for the next 7 years, and we're going to have to speed up the rate that we're planning on, you know, building all this new renewable technology. I think there's a lot of moving parts. There's also the buy-in from individuals themselves, and how they're going to start engaging with the electricity system, and, you know, network and grid reinforcement, and also, you know, storage. When is this storage going to be built? How is it, you know, what the markets are going to look like? These are all really important things. So I don't know if there's just one, but yeah.
It's a whole system, seismic change, really, absolutely. And then if we think about the interplay between the three areas, like we have the end of life fossil fuel systems that that will need to transition, plus increasing our renewable energy, and what then also the actual practical utilization of offshore wind and all that. Where do you see the kind of touch points between these three? Maybe Sarah, we stick with you on that for now.
Well, I think, well, just if I'm, you know, talking about reliability in the power system, I think offshore wind has a lot of benefits. It's more spatially distributed. So might be less periods of low wind and solar if we've got more offshore, especially floating offshore. I think it's a little bit more consistent as well in terms or in comparison to onshore, and can provide quite a lot of reserves. It's larger. So yeah, I think it could be it's very useful for system reliability, and yeah, in terms of biomass and you know, district heating and stuff like that. These are all kind of very interesting areas in terms of thermal storage potential for the grid.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Conall, what's come to mind as you've been listening to the other panel members?
Yeah, it's probably an issue that I would say is in the landscape, we seem to be quite siloed. So the decisions aren't really, at times, each person has a different strategy. And so it's really getting that joined up view that we're all working together and that each part. So it's taking that wider view of the first part. still meeting the last part. So instead of just thinking of how do we produce hydrogen, it's thinking about how does benefit does that provide to the energy system, what is needed and where that's needed.
Exactly, getting the optimal mix. Yeah, so and Fiona, over to you.
Yeah, it is getting that optimal mix, and I would agree that it's a need to think about all the different options that are available. I think the benefits of flow, as Sarah was saying, would be the fact that it can be on the south and the west coast as well, which will help in terms of its supply to different areas across the grid. And in terms of end of life and I think you mentioned the environmental impacts. That has a lot of advantages over fixed offshore wind in that respect.
Thank you all. Now, I've had a query in inquiring of the panel, and does the panel envisage V2G technology being widely employed on the Irish grid? Anybody has a contribute on that?
I'm not actually sure if it is being widely applied. I can say that in our model we haven't looked at it just yet. We're just assuming that we're load shifting rather than feeding into the grid.
Just something to look into.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And now just for a last moment, just again looking at what we chatted with the last panel, if where to next in the research. I know Fiona, you just started, but I no doubt you're already thinking of the next iteration of it. What's the ideal composition of the next iteration of this to actually get to make an impact on the ground? Sarah, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I thought it was really interesting to look at the new interconnection strategy that was published this year. So we're going to start looking at sensitivities with increased interconnection, and also looking at different types of longer duration storage. So we've really only looked at short and medium duration so far. So seeing the impact of those and maybe looking into the economics of these things a bit further.
Great. Maybe you can link in with Noreen from the prior session on that. Conall, any thoughts on your study?
Yeah, I probably have referenced it in the previous points, but I think I know what you're going to say. It's another strategy, but I definitely think something along the lines of, I know the UK released a biomass strategy quite recently, but it's something like that where it's consultative, we're looking at future demands, and it's cross-sectoral. So we're, for example, you're talking about storage, so it's that joint up thinking with heat and electricity, so looking at how thermal storage might benefit the electricity grid. Synergies like that can be missed when there's a team just looking at electricity or just looking at heat. So whatever way we can collaborate, I would definitely be all for that.
Yeah, definitely. We need all these different prongs of a consortium to bring together that joined up thinking and address wicked problems, because there's no one discipline that's going to solve this. Okay, and Fiona.
Well, we are just at the beginning of ours. I guess for floating offshore wind, what would be after this would be going from being an emerging technology and getting into the stage where we're really able to optimize and apply new innovations to make it even more affordable and reliable. So I think that would be the next step in terms of floating offshore wind once we've got it off. Deployed and we have our timeline, our roadmap. It would be to find more innovations that we can apply, and hopefully more innovations that will maximize our local content, for example, in terms of concrete substructures, etc.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Fiona. Okay, so this concludes the second part of the day, where we've showcased the current research towards a sustainable energy future. We will break now, returning at 2 p.m. for the third part of the day, which will focus on the future perspectives of energy security. So enjoy your lunch, and thank you very much for joining us.